31st, 2007, you wrote this great piece called Google versus Gold, which was your metaphor for optimistic investors investing in Google, and this is my interpretation, and pessimistic investors investing in gold. Both were climbing at the same time. And you said, which one's going to get to 850 first? Google was at 700 and gold was at 800. And at that point in time, Google that was the very top of Google, the very top, yes. That week, when you wrote that piece.
And I owned way too much Google stock because I was a YouTube investor and I was still in lockup. I was not ahead of it.
And gold's up 75%. My question for you is not about that, because I think your metaphor was right. Google was probably the wrong horse. And Apple's already proven Apple's up 90% over that same period. So they probably were the right horse for that metaphor. But your premise is that Google was the first beneficiary of the Creator Society because of this idea of search strings and people getting results out. I could argue that Google might have been the first victim of the Creator Society because of Facebook, Twitter, and all the explicit creator companies that follow and have made their life more challenging. Do you want to comment about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, if there is a patron saint of what we're going through right now, it is most sure an economic patron saint. It is not John Maynard Keynes, it is Joseph Schumpeter, because we're all trying to live our lives through this vast gales of creative destruction that technology is inducing. So I think Google launched the creator economy in many ways, but are they going to make it all the way? Well, I still own too much Google stock, so I'm hoping they will, at least for a while. But I think you're right. There's, we got Facebook, we've got the others coming on. But there's another aspect to that piece I wrote. So the chart, this was November 2007, and I, as a forecaster, another one of the rules of thumb I follow is I look for contradictions. I look for things that just don't make sense. And I looked at Google and gold, both going upwards more or less in parallel, and I thought, this is very strange. Because in general, in the past, when times are good, gold is low and stocks are high. And when times are bad, it's the reverse. And so gold is high and stocks are low. And this was a moment where the stocks were still high and gold was still high. When change clusters at the extremes, you can bet more fundamental change lies ahead. Now, what I said to my clients at the time, I said, I don't know what's going on, but I have a really bad feeling about 2008. I did not forecast the downturn, but to me, it was just a flashing light that something crazy was about to happen. And so my advice is, look for things like that. Look for things that don't fit. They are usually early indicators that there's some overturn that lies ahead.
And people are making the same analogies today between Apple and gold that have been going up together the same. And we may be at that same point that you talk about of turbulence.
Yeah, well, of course, Apple's a special case because, even Steve Jobs has wrestled with the angel once, and at least wrestled the angel to a draw, but we don't know what an Apple, is an Apple without Steve Jobs like a Disney without Walt Disney? Or is it something else? That's a big question. Here's what I think is the even bigger shift we have going on, that there's this rise of the creator economy, but that contradiction between Google and gold. I look back and I think Alan Greenspan must be the world's luckiest economist. He came into office, 1986? 1987, and he got out in 2006. Timing. That period, of course, has a label. That period of stable interest rates that were not too high or too low, relatively stable, low unemployment, steady manufacturing, at least in the United States here. And the label for the 20-year period that Jim Stock gave to it in 2002 was the Great Moderation. The Great Moderation was this wonderful period of mostly sunny weather with an occasional storm. And we know that, and of course in 2002 it was very touching. Everybody's talking about the end of business cycles. And is this the new order we move beyond? And for me as a forecaster, it's like, oh yeah, thank you very much. There's an indicator, it's time to start thinking about readjusting one's portfolio. The Great Moderation ended. The question is, what are we in today? Pessimists will tell you This is a moment in time when pessimism is the new black. You know, it's fashionable to be down on everything. It's fashionable to figure that the Tokyo earthquake is the end of Japan. I think it's the opposite. I think this is the cardiac paddles on Japan that's going to wake it up and get it back on track. But we're also, there are others who say it's a new techno-nirvana. I don't think it's either. If I gave a name to the next 20 years, it would be the Great Turbulence. We're entering an era, thanks to technology and globalization and the like, that the forces that kept things moderate in the last 2 decades have disappeared. You know, we could get a wild card like oil, you know, Iran screwing up oil prices in the late 1980s, but the central institutions were strong enough that even if there was a wild card event, we could pull things back to the middle. Well, that strong force pulling things back to the middle has been weakened. And so now events at the edge have a disproportionate impact. So if the Great Moderation was a sunny period with the occasional storm, this next 20 years will be a stormy period with occasional breaks in the weather. And that is neither good news nor bad news. That is just an environment that is not for the fearful. For those who can take a long-term view and have the courage to stay in the game, periods of turbulence are opportunities to create vast wealth.
Now, I assume that that's all hand in hand with this new creator society. Is this creator society a worldwide phenomenon? Are we mostly seeing it here, or are you seeing it everywhere?
Well, I think creator society is definitely global. I mean, look at Zynga. The Zynga started in that model of cell phone games started in Korea, got exported to China, and then, you know, thanks to our lousy telecommunications infrastructure in the United States, we didn't get it until the latter half of this decade. But yeah, this is global and borderless.
So, Ketjar started out of Lithuania as the largest, you know, central of mobile applications. Earlier this morning, Judith McHale, the Undersecretary, talked about millions of cell phones in Africa, creating opportunity there. Is that what you're seeing around the world?
I think that's part of the story. You know, first of all, whenever we have a new technology, we always use the new technology to do an old thing more efficiently. We, in essence, pave the cow paths. You know, whenever somebody comes in with asphalt, the first thing they do is they look at where the horses and the cows went and they pave it. So we always imitate the old thing. So, but once it arrives, then we start innovating and we do new things. And so it really is exciting. We're about 10 years into cell phones going into the developing world, and they've been doing already lots of innovative things that are very different than the West. And so it's not only the opportunity for new kinds of products in the developing world, it's the opportunity for new insights for our markets.
So to the people here who want to be CEOs also, I want to follow up on a point to your talk. Which you said if I paraphrase it right, in the early 1900s, the road to be CEO was to be the VP of manufacturing. In the second half of the early 20th century, right, early 1900s, the second half of the 20th century was to be the VP of marketing. So what is it now? What in the creator society, how do I become the CEO?
I'm guilty as charged. I don't know yet. I mean, the important thing about this economy is it's just started. There are lots of pieces of it that don't make any more sense today than the mass media consumer economy did in the early 1950s. So I think the short answer is it's just like in 1950, the start of the consumer economy. You know, it wouldn't have been bad to be a VP of sales or marketing at Procter & Gamble, but you would have been better being an entrepreneur starting something new. I'd much rather have been a producer at a small television network than an executive at Procter.
So is that the creator society? Is it Mark Zuckerberg stays CEO, Larry Page comes back as CEO, I guess yesterday Jack Dorsey came back at Twitter. Is now the road to be CEO to be an entrepreneur?
I think the road is absolutely either be an entrepreneur or be a junior employee at one of the established companies. I mean, Google's the establishment now. That would be what I do.
Let me shift you to some other things you've heard about because they're so great. And that's about economics/politics, and then we'll talk about religion. audience, but economics. So you said when the Berlin Wall came, you wrote this in 2007, and I think you actually started on this theory in 2005, but you wrote when the Berlin Wall came down, capitalism won. But capitalism is not one size fits all. You talked about 3 different forms of capitalism, where here in the United States we're primarily entrepreneurial capitalism, but you also talked about, if I remember right, cultural capitalism and community capitalism in different parts of the world. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. You know, Americans, we're so naive. We always think that everybody wants to be just like us, and we ignore adjectives we should have them. And Americans think capitalism is what Americans have, which really what we have is entrepreneurial market capitalism in the United States. It worships the individual, it glorifies and loves innovation, it loves change. So we're hooked on change, and we worship the individual, even though in fact most of our innovations are team-based. Well, think about it, there are already 2 other very large variations on capitalism in the world. There's cultural capitalism in Europe. Call it Monet capitalism after Jean Monnet, the father of the European community. Cultural capitalism does not worship the individual. I mean, you know, look how France treats people who go bankrupt. And above all, it worships continuity. It sees economic innovation in the service of continuity. That's why France passed laws and made it an offense to work overtime. They were arresting CEOs symbolically. And you look at like Switzerland, where cows get a bigger subsidy in Switzerland than, you know, most of the aid people in the developing world. Well, it's not because the farm lobby is strong. It's because the cows are an essential part of the Swiss landscape. And unless you have cows munching the grass, you are going to end up with avalanches and other changes. And by the way, we can see what matters in a capitalist system by what they put on our currency. You know, in the United States, we put dead white guys on our currency. In Europe, they put cultural monuments. But of course, they're not real cultural monuments, because then you might offend the Italians if you put a French monument up. So we've created these artificial portmanteau monuments on the euro. Cultural capitalism values continuity and other things. And of course, then you have capital systems going in competition. The Europeans, you know, Airbus says Boeing gets unfair subsidies because it gets money from the Department of Defense. Boeing says Airbus gets unfair subsidies because the government's help pay. Well, Airbus is subsidized so you can keep jobs going. Both sides are right within their system, but they differ in the system values. The third one, of course, is community capitalism in Asia. One could call it Confucian capitalism, but I think that's rather insulting. Community capitalism emphasizes a larger community rather than the individual. And it's innovative, but innovative within a context. And I think that Singapore is a pretty good example of community capitalism.